Okay, this card is already telling me why people get fascinated by you because we have the sun showing up reversed, and symbolically, that is interesting for this topic. Not because your light is gone, it feels like the opposite. You carry this warm, innocent, childlike brightness, but you don't always seem aware of how strongly other people experience it. That's the part I keep coming back to. You may think you're just being yourself. You laugh when something is funny. You get excited about little things. You're curious. You can be playful in moments where everybody else is trying to look composed, serious, impressive. And somehow, instead of making you look immature, it makes you feel real. People notice that. There's something disarming about someone who hasn't edited every ounce of wonder out of themselves. And the sun reversed as a psychological symbol makes me think you may underestimate this quality. You might dim it. You might question whether you're too enthusiastic, too soft, too expressive, too easily delighted. Maybe there have even been moments where you felt like you needed to tone yourself down because other people seemed more guarded. But here's what's fascinating. Those same people can be the ones most mesmerized by you because they're looking at something they miss in themselves. You remind people of what it felt like before everything became calculated. Before every reaction had to be cool, before joy needed permission, there is this unpolished sweetness around you that says, I still know how to feel something without immediately judging myself for feeling it, and that is rare. Some people meet you and feel lighter without understanding why. They laugh more easily. They loosen up, they become a little sillier, and they may tell themselves they enjoy your company, but there's a deeper reason. You are giving them access to a version of themselves they thought they had outgrown. And this first card is only scratching the surface because the next symbol is where I want to see whether people simply enjoy your light or become attached to how they feel around you. And with the Knight of Pentacles reversed coming in here, it feels like that attachment has a lot to do with what happens to people's usual sense of control when they're around you. Because symbolically, this can be someone who is normally very contained, responsible, predictable, maybe even a little too used to monitoring themselves. They know what they should say. They know how they should behave. They keep things moving. They handle what needs to be handled. And then they get around you and something loosens. You may notice somebody who is usually quiet suddenly talking more than they intended to. Someone very serious starts making ridiculous jokes. A person who normally takes a long time to trust people tells you something surprisingly personal and then almost seems confused by the fact that they told you. That matters. Because you're not sitting there trying to pull anything out of them. You're not performing warmth so they'll open up. You're not carefully creating some atmosphere where they feel obligated to be vulnerable. It seems to happen because they don't feel watched around you. And for certain people, that feeling is incredibly unusual. They may spend so much of their life being useful, composed, skeptical, responsible, or self-conscious that being around someone who responds naturally gives them permission to do the same. So now they're not only thinking, I like this person. They're thinking, without necessarily having words for it, I like who I am when I'm here. That's a different kind of fascination. That's why somebody might linger after everyone else has left. Why a conversation that could have ended 20 minutes ago somehow keeps going. Why they remember a tiny joke you made weeks later or find some completely reasonable excuse to send you a message again. The interaction becomes associated with relief, with warmth, with not having to manage themselves quite so carefully. And I think this is where your innocent quality becomes much more psychologically interesting because innocence here doesn't mean naive. It feels more like an absence of unnecessary calculation. People sense that they can put something down around you, and once someone realizes how good that feels, they may start seeking your presence without fully understanding what they're actually seeking. Because if they feel unusually free around you, what happens when they leave and discover that version of themselves doesn't appear so easily everywhere else? That's where simple enjoyment can begin turning into something much harder for them to dismiss. And the lovers coming in here makes that even more interesting because symbolically, this card can be about recognition. Seeing something in another person that brings you face to face with something in yourself. And I think that's part of what happens with you. Your innocence doesn't feel like ignorance. You may understand perfectly well that people can be complicated. You may have experienced disappointment, awkwardness, rejection. You probably know when someone is being strange, guarded, performative, or overly concerned with how they're coming across. You're not unaware of any of that. You just haven't allowed awareness to completely replace sincerity. That's different. You can know that something is considered uncool and still openly enjoy it. You can ask a genuine question without pretending you already know the answer. You can get excited about some tiny detail everybody else overlooked and not immediately stop yourself because you're worried you look too impressed. And people notice that too. Especially people who trained themselves out of those reactions, someone may have learned very early that sarcasm keeps them safe, that being detached makes rejection hurt less, that appearing independent prevents anybody from knowing what they actually need. So when they meet you, there can be this almost unconscious curiosity, like, how are you still like this? How did you remain soft without being completely unaware? How can you laugh that freely when you know people are watching? How can you genuinely like something without checking whether everybody else approves first? And the lovers psychologically makes me think that what they're seeing is a choice they didn't realize was still available. Maybe maturity didn't actually require becoming emotionally numb. Maybe being intelligent didn't require becoming cynical. Maybe growing up didn't mean constantly standing outside of your own experience, monitoring how everything looks. That can be incredibly refreshing. But it can also become uncomfortable. Because sometimes the thing somebody loves about you is also the thing that quietly reminds them of what they gave up. They may admire your openness and feel irritated by it 5 minutes later. They may want to protect that sweetness while also testing it. They may feel drawn toward you and strangely defensive around you at the same time. And that's where this starts getting more complicated. Because the same quality that makes people want to come closer can also awaken envy, protectiveness, and sometimes even a subtle desire to keep that feeling for themselves. And the Eight of Swords reversed coming in here feels almost perfect for that. Because symbolically, this is where somebody starts realizing that the assumptions they brought into the interaction may not actually fit you. They keep looking for the catch, and sometimes there isn't one. Someone who is used to hidden motives may have a surprisingly difficult time accepting that you really were just being friendly, that you laughed because you genuinely found something funny, that you asked about them because you were actually curious. So they test it, not always consciously. Maybe they tease you a little more than everybody else to see how you respond. Maybe somebody who was initially very warm becomes oddly critical, almost like they're trying to find the flaw that will make you easier to understand. Or they start telling you how the world works. You know people will take advantage of that. You're too trusting. You can't be nice to everybody. And sometimes there is genuine protectiveness underneath that. They see softness and immediately associate it with vulnerability. So they feel this urge to warn you, defend you, or keep an eye on the people coming around you. But other times, it feels more complicated because if your presence gives somebody that sense of relief we were talking about, they may not love seeing everybody else receive the same version of you. Suddenly, they're a little quieter when someone else gets your attention, a little more curious about who you're talking to, maybe even slightly possessive without having any real claim to be. And again, I wouldn't automatically call that jealousy. It feels more like your openness is touching something they haven't completely worked through. The Eight of Swords reversed is interesting because it can symbolize questioning a mental story. And you may become the person who challenges someone's story that everybody has an angle, everybody eventually becomes cold, or nobody is really that sincere. That can feel freeing, but it can also make them uncomfortable. And I wonder if you've ever interpreted that discomfort as something being wrong with you. Maybe someone's teasing made you think you were too expressive. Their criticism made you wonder if you were too trusting. Their sudden distance made you question whether you had somehow misread the connection. But sometimes their reaction was less about something you did and more about what being around you brought up in them. And the next part gets even more revealing because I don't just want to look at how people act while you're standing in front of them. I want to look at what stays with them after you've already left. And the Three of Wands coming in here makes me think a lot of that happens at a distance. Not necessarily physical distance, just after the moment is over, after you've gone home, after the conversation ends, after everyone goes back to being who they normally are. That's when some of the smallest things seem to stick. Someone may remember the way you laughed at something completely ridiculous, the way you got genuinely excited because the food was good, or because you saw an animal, or because a song you love came on at exactly the right moment. Maybe you pointed out the sky, maybe you remembered some strange little fact they told you. Maybe there was an inside joke that objectively wasn't even that funny, but somehow they remember it. And I don't think it's always because the moment itself was extraordinary. It's because of how unguarded they were inside of it. For a few minutes, they weren't trying to seem interesting. They weren't checking themselves. They weren't thinking about what the interaction meant or whether they were saying the right thing. They were just there, with you. So later, the memory carries more than the actual event. They remember who they became around you. That's why you can sometimes leave a strangely nostalgic impression even on people who didn't know you for very long. Not everyone, obviously. But some people may know you briefly and still remember the connection with this emotional texture that feels much older. Almost like you touched a part of them that existed before they became so careful. And this Three of Wands has that quality for me, symbolically. Looking outward, remembering something that is no longer directly in front of you and noticing that it still has an effect. This is where that whole idea of wanting to bottle your magic starts making sense. Because someone may try to figure out what exactly you did. Was it the way you talked? The humor? The friendliness? Could they recreate that same feeling with somebody else? And usually, it doesn't reduce that neatly. Because the quality people are responding to doesn't seem rehearsed. You're not using a technique to appear innocent. You're not carefully performing spontaneity. So imitation misses something. Which makes me wonder what people are actually sensing beneath all of this. Because there seems to be a contradiction in you that makes this much harder to categorize than simple sweetness. And I think the next card is going to show us exactly what that contradiction is. And the Four of Cups coming in here makes that contradiction very clear because this is not a card I would associate with someone who is simply floating through life without noticing what's happening. There's observation here, there's discernment. There's a part of you that watches more than people initially realize. And I think that surprises them. Because you might be laughing over something completely silly 1 minute, and then the conversation shifts, and you make one observation that goes straight to the center of what everybody else has been dancing around. Suddenly they're thinking, oh, you noticed that. You may ask a question that sounds completely innocent, but somehow it exposes a contradiction somebody was hoping nobody would mention. Or you can be incredibly warm with someone and still quietly say no when something doesn't feel right. No big performance, no need to become cold. You just don't move. And that's where people realize your softness is not the same thing as passivity. Your openness is not an absence of judgment. You can be curious without being gullible. Sweet without being easy to control, playful without being oblivious. Those things coexist. And symbolically, the Four of Cups makes me think people can keep revising their first impression of you because they never quite get to finish putting you into a category. They think, oh, they're adorable. Then you say something unexpectedly perceptive. They decide you're deeply serious. Then you're delighted by something completely ridiculous 5 minutes later. So what exactly are you? That's the fascination. Not because you're trying to be mysterious. You're just not reducing yourself to one personality trait. And honestly, that may be the closest thing here to this idea of bottling your magic. Because what would they even bottle? The openness without the performance, the softness without complete passivity, the wonder without emptiness, the depth without making every interaction heavy. It's the combination. And combinations are harder to imitate than individual traits. I also think this is why some people may feel unusually safe telling you things they normally edit out. They sense warmth, so they relax. Then they realize there's enough depth there to actually understand what they're saying. And once those two things meet, people can reveal more than they planned to. Which is where this gets really interesting because the next layer is about the confessions, projections, and hidden truths that seem to come toward you even when you never consciously asked for them. And the Five of Wands reversed coming in here makes me think this happens because people stop feeling like they have to compete with you. They don't have to impress you. They don't have to win the conversation. They don't have to make their story sound better, smarter, funnier, or more interesting than it really is. And that changes what people are willing to say. Someone can be talking to you about something completely ordinary, and then suddenly they're telling you about a fear they've never really admitted out loud. Or a childhood memory, a strange dream, something they secretly want to do with their life, but feel embarrassed even saying. And then there's that little pause afterward. Like, why did I just tell you that? You may have seen that expression before. Because I don't think this is only about you being a good listener. It feels more specific than that. There's something about your reactions that doesn't immediately make people feel evaluated. You can be surprised without making them feel ridiculous. You can laugh with them without turning what they said into a joke. You can be curious without making the conversation feel like an interrogation. So people skip layers. The Five of Wands reversed psychologically can represent that moment when someone stops defending their position. And around you, some people seem to stop defending their personality too. They just say the thing, the insecurity, the family issue, the private longing, the part of themselves that normally gets edited before anybody else gets to see it. And once that happens, the connection can suddenly feel much deeper than the amount of time you've actually known each other, because now they associate you with honesty. Not only your honesty, their own. That can create closeness very quickly, but it can also make somebody nervous. They may become quieter afterward. They might act strangely casual the next time they see you, or even pull back a little as though they're trying to restore some distance. And you could easily read that as, oh, maybe they weren't that interested in talking to me after all. But sometimes the opposite may be true. Sometimes they're adjusting to the fact that they showed you something they normally keep hidden. Because being understood can feel good. Being seen that quickly can feel exposing, and if this dynamic already becomes intense in ordinary friendship or conversation, then I really want to look at what happens when attraction enters the picture. Because softness, emotional safety, and chemistry together can create a very different kind of fascination. And the moon reversed coming in here makes that romantic layer especially interesting because symbolically, this is where somebody starts realizing that their first impression of you didn't tell them the whole story. They thought they understood the attraction. Maybe you were just sweet, easy to talk to, a little playful, and then something changes. They notice that you're not actually trying very hard to be desirable. You might get distracted halfway through a conversation because something genuinely caught your attention. You laugh at a moment when everybody else is trying to stay composed. You admit that you love something completely unfashionable without checking whether they think it's cool. And strangely, that can create more chemistry than somebody carefully managing every expression. Because there's no obvious performance to respond to. You're just there. And in a romantic context, that can be incredibly disarming. But the moon reversed also makes me think the fascination deepens when someone discovers that your openness does not mean complete access. That's important. You can be warm without telling everybody everything. You can be friendly without feeling deeply connected to everyone who likes you. You can answer a sincere question sincerely and still have an entire inner world that somebody hasn't earned their way into yet. So there's this interesting gap. At first, your sweetness can make you seem easy to understand. Then they realize you're actually selective, not necessarily intentionally mysterious, just discerning. And suddenly they want to know what makes somebody get closer, what makes you trust, what makes you choose one person to show more of yourself to than another. That's where attraction can become much more personal. Because now it isn't only, I want this person. For some people, it becomes, I want this person to choose me. There's a difference, especially when they've seen how naturally you respond to life. If your excitement looks genuine, your affection probably feels meaningful too. If you're not constantly performing enthusiasm, then when you genuinely light up around someone, they notice. And that is not something a person can manufacture by copying your mannerisms. The second somebody tries to deliberately perform innocence, the quality changes. What works here is that you don't seem preoccupied with producing an effect. And I think that's why being chosen by you can carry so much emotional weight for certain people. Because underneath the attraction is a much deeper question. What does it mean about them if someone this sincere looks at them and genuinely says, in one way or another, I like you? That's the part I want to go into next. And the Six of Wands coming in here makes that question almost impossible to ignore because symbolically, this card has so much to do with recognition, not empty attention. Recognition. There's a difference. Because I think some people aren't just hoping you'll notice them. They want to see themselves reflected in your reaction. If they make you laugh, they believe the joke actually landed. If you compliment something they made, wore, said, or accomplished, it may stay with them longer because it doesn't feel like you were simply being polite. If they tell you a story and you become genuinely interested, they get to feel interesting, not impressive. Interesting. And that distinction matters. You may notice people wanting to show you things. A song they love, something they created, a picture they took, good news they haven't told many people yet. And sometimes they're watching your face while you take it in, because your reaction gives them something very clear. There's less guessing. You seem delighted when you're delighted, curious when you're curious, moved when something actually reaches you. So for someone who spends a lot of time around social performance, that can feel unusually valuable. And suddenly, all these cards start connecting. Why people remember little moments with you. Why they sometimes reveal too much. Why attraction can become strangely personal. Why somebody might feel protective of you, slightly envious of others around you, or unusually affected when your attention shifts elsewhere. It isn't necessarily because you're doing something extraordinary. It's because around you, emotion may feel less staged. That is what they're trying to return to. That's what they wish they could bottle. Not a laugh, not a personality trick, not some specific way of talking. The feeling of being in an interaction where somebody seems genuinely there. But I also want to be careful with this because none of that means you owe people constant access to that version of you. You do not have to be bright every time somebody wants reassurance. You don't have to react enthusiastically so another person can feel interesting. And you certainly don't have to keep yourself emotionally available just because somebody likes who they become around you. That would turn something natural into another performance. And I think that's the final piece, because maybe the lesson here isn't how to become more magnetic. Maybe it's understanding why you never needed to harden yourself in order to grow up. And the last thing I want to look at is how you protect that softness without confusing protection with shrinking it. And the Ace of Swords reversed coming in here feels important because symbolically, this can be about questioning the conclusions you've made about yourself, especially the ones you learned from other people. Maybe somewhere along the way, you started interpreting softness as something you needed to correct. You thought you needed to become less expressive, less easily impressed, less trusting, maybe even a little harder to read. But I keep thinking about that sun reversed from the beginning because now it looks different. Maybe your light was never missing. Maybe you just didn't realize how visible it was. And protecting that quality doesn't mean remaining naive. It doesn't mean ignoring red flags or pretending everybody deserves access to you. You can notice when something feels off and still be warm. You can have boundaries and still laugh loudly. You can understand disappointment and still get ridiculously excited about something small. Discernment and wonder can exist in the same person. That might actually be the whole point. Because there's a difference between someone who enjoys your light and someone who respects the person carrying it. Pay attention to that. Some people will love that you make them feel freer, but they'll also respect when you're quiet, when you say no, when you don't have energy to reassure them, when your attention belongs somewhere else. Others may seem much more interested in maintaining access to the feeling you create for them, and those are not quite the same thing. You don't have to become cynical to recognize the difference. That's what I think the Ace of Swords reversed is clearing up. The confusion was thinking maturity required you to lose something. It doesn't. People cannot really bottle this quality because there is no formula behind it. It isn't your laugh by itself. It isn't the way you ask questions. It isn't some aesthetic somebody can copy. It comes from that permission you still give yourself to respond to life. And that's why people loosen around you. Why they unexpectedly confess things. Why they remember tiny moments that shouldn't have mattered that much. Why they look for your reaction. Because for a moment, something feels genuine. So maybe the part of you that you once wondered whether you should tone down was never the embarrassing part. Maybe it was the memorable part. The part that quietly reminds certain people how good it feels to be fully there. And long after the conversation ends, that may be exactly what they remember about you.